I've cared for hundreds of patients throughout my career. And in the end, almost all of them say the same thing. And no, it's not about the pain. It's not about the illness either. And it's definitely not about the fear of dying, like most people assume. Because when that moment comes, the body is no longer the center of the conversation. What shows up at the very end is something else. A quiet realization. One that feels like it arrived too late. It took me years to understand that. At the beginning of my career, I thought the hardest part of the job was dealing with death itself. I thought the weight was in the machines shutting off, the monitors beeping, the reactions of the families. But over time, I started to notice something different. What stayed with me the most wasn't the moment of death. It was what came right before it. Those final conversations. Sometimes so soft they were almost whispers. The way some patients would stare at the ceiling, as if revisiting something no one else in the room could see. And most of all, the kind of sentence that kept repeating itself. It didn't matter their age. It didn't matter if they had lived a long life, or thought they still had time. It didn't matter how complete their life looked from the outside. In the end, the feeling was strangely similar, and that started to bother me. Because it wasn't coincidence. It was a pattern. My name is Aina. I've been a nurse for 12 years, and during that time, I've been present in long, quiet shifts, inside rooms, where time seems to slow down in a way that feels different. I learned to notice things that don't appear in medical charts. The way someone holds another person's hand, the silence between two sentences, the pause before answering a simple question. Things that don't show up in exams, but reveal so much more. I've seen people surrounded by family and still feel completely alone. And I've seen the opposite too. People with almost nothing, yet carrying a kind of peace that didn't need explanation. And somewhere in the middle of all that, I began to recognize a very specific moment. A point that's almost invisible, but once it arrives, everything changes. It wasn't when the doctor gave the diagnosis, not when the condition got worse. It came before that. It was when the person finally stopped distracting themselves, stopped postponing things, stopped believing this wasn't about them yet. And in that space, in that silence heavier than any sound, something would surface. Not panic. Not fear, but a realization. Simple. Clear. And somehow unavoidable. A sentence that didn't feel rehearsed, that didn't come from anyone else, that felt like it had always been there, just waiting for that exact moment to emerge. And when it was finally spoken, there was no urgency left. No excuses. Just a kind of clarity that I rarely see outside of those rooms. That's when I understood. The problem never starts in the hospital. And by the time people get there, most of the story has already been written. After a while, I stopped focusing only on individual stories. Because when you see the same thing happening over and over again, in completely different contexts, you start to realize it's no longer about the person. It's about the pattern. At first, I thought what I was hearing at the end had to do with specific choices, like someone who worked too much, or someone who drifted away from their family, or someone who simply made bad decisions. But the more I observed, the less that explanation made sense. Because I started seeing the same kind of regret in people who had nothing in common. People with money, and people who had very little. People who lived intense, full lives, and others who lived quietly, without much conflict. Even people who, from the outside, seemed to have done everything right. Stable career, structured family, organized routine, and still, in the end, the feeling that surfaced was strikingly similar. That's what caught my attention the most. It wasn't about what they did wrong. It was about what they never realized while there was still time. I began noticing small behaviors that repeated themselves long before that final moment. Simple things, almost invisible in everyday life. People who always postponed what truly mattered. Conversations that never happened because it wasn't the right time. Decisions delayed, as if time would always be available. And the most curious part, back then, none of it felt urgent. If anything, it felt normal. Acceptable. Even comfortable. I've seen patients who spent years saying they were doing it for a better future, working too much, exhausting themselves, giving up meaningful parts of their lives, always believing that, at some point, it would all make sense. That point rarely came the way they expected. I've also seen people who avoided conflict at all costs, who swallowed discomfort, adapted, reshaped themselves, just to maintain a sense of stability. And from the outside, everything looked fine. But over time, that turned into distance. Into silence. Into a life where important things simply stopped existing, without anyone noticing exactly when. And then years later, when there was finally time to look back, it wasn't the illness that weighed the most. It was the accumulation of those small compromises, those quiet adjustments that seemed harmless, but over time, completely changed the direction of their lives. That's when I realized the pattern wasn't in the kind of life someone lived. It was in how they related to time. Almost everyone believes, in some way, that there will still be time. Time to fix things. Time to change. Time to say what needs to be said. And as long as that belief exists, people keep living on autopilot. They postpone important decisions, ignore internal signals, settle into routines they no longer question, until there comes a point where time stops being an idea and becomes something real. Limited. And in that moment, everything that was postponed returns. Not as overwhelming guilt, but as clarity. A kind of clarity that doesn't scream, but doesn't allow distraction anymore. And the hardest part to accept is that this realization doesn't appear suddenly. It was being built slowly. In every small choice, every silence, every delay that once felt insignificant. I didn't see this happen once or twice. I saw it dozens, maybe hundreds of times. And that's what made me stop seeing these stories as isolated cases. Because, deep down, they were never that different. I remember one patient in particular, not because his story was extreme, but exactly because it wasn't. His name was Roberto. He was in his early 60s, and from the outside, he was the kind of person most people would say had lived a good life. When he arrived, he wasn't in critical condition. It was one of those cases that slowly got worse over time. Like most of them do. Nothing sudden, nothing dramatic. Just that quiet kind of wear that builds up over the years. I started caring for him during a night shift. The room was calm, dim lights, the steady sound of monitors, but nothing urgent. He was easygoing. Polite. Did single quotes talk much, but always answered when spoken to. At first, nothing seemed unusual. But as the days passed, certain things started to stand out. Not his medical condition. His behavior. He spent a lot of time in silence, but it wasn't a resting kind of silence. It felt different, like he was busy, even when doing nothing. Sometimes I'd walk into the room, and he'd be staring at the wall or the ceiling, with an expression that was hard to describe. It wasn't pain, that it wasn't fear, it was closer to effort. like he was trying to sort something out inside his own mind. His family came to visit. His wife, especially. She would sit next to him, try to start conversations, talk about simple things, everyday life, and he would respond, but always briefly without going deeper without really stepping into the moment. And that pattern repeated itself. Day after day, no arguments, no visible conflict, but also no real connection. And that kind of absence shows up in subtle ways. Small pauses, avoided eye contact, conversations that never quite move forward. There was one night that stayed with me. It was late. The hospital quieter than usual. I walked in to check his vitals, and he was awake, staring into nothing like always. But this time, something felt different. I asked if he needed anything, and he took a while to respond. Not because he didn't hear me, but like he was choosing his words carefully. Then he said, "It's funny. You think you're building something." And stop. Silence. I didn't interrupt. After a few seconds, he continued. But in the end, it feels like I was just postponing everything. He wasn't crying. He wasn't emotional in an obvious way. His voice was almost neutral, but there was a weight to it that was impossible to ignore. In the following days, he started talking a bit more. Not to everyone, but sometimes, when I was there, during simple routines, changing a dressing, adjusting medication, ordinary moments. And in those moments, his story began to unfold. Slowly. Out of order, not as a complete narrative. Fragments. He said he had worked his whole life, that his goal was always to provide security for his family, that he avoided conflict, preferred stability, didn't like to complicate life. And for a long time, that approach worked. Life moved forward. Years passed, and everything seemed under control. But within those conversations, small pauses started to appear, moments where it felt like he was realizing what he was saying. As he was saying it. At one point, he said, "I always thought I'd have more time later," and fell silent again. As if that sentence alone already explained everything. His wife kept visiting. Always present. Always trying. But now, something had shifted in the room. Like both of them were starting to realize, at the same time, that there was a distance between them. A distance that didn't appear suddenly, but was built slowly, over years. No fights. No dramatic breaks. Just absence. And the hardest part to witness wasn't his condition. It was that awareness settling in. Gradually. Quietly. But impossible to ignore. Because there wasn't a single big mistake to point at. No specific moment where everything went wrong. And maybe that's exactly what makes it heavier. It was just a sequence of small choices, small delays, small compromises, that together created a life he no longer fully recognized at the end. I had seen that before, more times than I'd like to admit. There was a moment that wasn't marked by any test. No sudden decline. Medical update. And yet, that was when everything shifted. I walked into his room one morning. Quieter than usual. Soft light coming through the window. The kind that makes everything feel almost still. He was awake. But unlike the other days, he wasn't staring at the ceiling. He was looking at his own hand. As if noticing something he had never really paid attention to before. I stepped closer, did what I needed to do, checked his vitals, adjusted a few things, and just before I left, he spoke, without looking at me. I thought I was doing the right thing. That was it. But it didn't feel like a random sentence. It felt like the conclusion of something he had been silently processing for days. I didn't respond because it didn't feel like he was asking for one. He continued. He said he always believed stability was what mattered most, that avoiding problems was a way of protecting his life, that giving certain things up was just part of the process. And as he spoke, there was no anger. No frustration. Just a kind of understanding. Arriving too late. Then he said something that stayed with me. I didn't notice when I started living on autopilot. And that was the moment, exactly that moment, when something clicked for me in a different way. Because until then, I thought end-of-life regret came from big mistakes, bad decisions, clear turning points. But no, most of the time, it doesn't. The problem was never what he did wrong. It was what he failed to notice. While he was still living. It was the absence of awareness, in the middle of his own routine, and that changes everything. Because this isn't about exceptions. It's not about people who failed. It's about something far more common and far more subtle. In the days that followed, Roberto didn't talk much about it anymore, but he didn't need to, because once that awareness arrives, it doesn't leave. It stays. Present. In every silence. In every lingering glance. And I started connecting that moment to other stories. Other faces. Other rooms. I've seen business owners who spent their entire lives building something, and at the end weren't sure what it was. I've seen mothers who lived entirely for others, and in the end couldn't answer what they wanted for themselves. I've seen people who avoided conflict at all costs and ended up with empty relationships. And in all those cases, the pattern was the same. Wasn't a tragedy. It was a slow construction, almost invisible. A life shaped on autopilot, built around avoiding discomfort, maintaining stability, postponing what felt difficult. And for a long time. It works. It works well enough that no one questions it. Until a moment comes when it becomes impossible not to see it. And when that moment arrives, the realization is almost always the same. No matter the story, no matter the path, the feeling converges. And that's what stayed with me the most over the years. Not a specific story, but the understanding that, deep down, they were all saying the same thing. In different ways. In different lives. But pointing to the exact same place. And once I started seeing that, it became impossible not to recognize that pattern outside the hospital too. After Roberto, something shifted in the way I listened to people's silence, because before that, I still believed that kind of realization only appeared at the end, like it was a result of being close to death, like it naturally came from knowing time was running out. But that's not what happens. What I slowly began to understand over the years is that this feeling doesn't start there. It's already there, much earlier. Just diluted, hidden inside routine, disguised in small decisions that never seem important enough to question. And maybe that's exactly why almost no one notices, because there's no clear breaking point. There's no single day where someone wakes up and thinks, from now on, I'm going to drift away from my own life. No. It happens in a much more subtle way, much more acceptable. People start by prioritizing what feels urgent. Then they begin postponing what actually matters. Then they get used to it. And eventually, they stop questioning it altogether. I started noticing this outside the hospital. In everyday conversations. In healthy people. In lives that seemed completely normal. People who are busy all day, but can't really explain with what. People who handle everything, except what truly bothers them. People who maintain relationships, I'd avoid any conversation that might actually change something. And the most curious part, from the outside, everything looks functional. Life keeps moving. Responsibilities are met. Nothing collapses. But there's a subtle difference between a life that functions and a life that is actually lived. And that difference is rarely noticed. When it begins. It only becomes visible later. When there's no way to go back. There heard many variations of that same final sentence. Some people say it clearly. Others can't fully put it into words. But the feeling is always similar. It's as if, in that final moment, the person is seeing their life without distraction, without justification. Without the narrative they built over the years to make everything feel coherent. And what shows up isn't always something dramatic. Sometimes it's just emptiness. A kind of absence that's hard to explain. Like something important was missing, but no one can point to exactly when it disappeared. And that's what stayed with me there. Most. Not the regret itself, but the fact that it rarely came from something obvious. It didn't come from a major failure. It came from a sequence of small choices that never seemed dangerous. And this is the hardest part to accept, because it's not dramatic. It doesn't demand attention. But once you understand it, it's impossible to ignore. People don't lose their lives all at once. They give them up slowly. Through small compromises, through silences meant to avoid discomfort, through postponed decisions that seem harmless, through routines that are never questioned, because they're working. And that creates distance. A distance between what a person lives and what they actually experience, between what they do and what it really means. And that distance grows. Slowly. Without warning, without urgency. Until one day, it becomes impossible not to see it. And when that day comes, there's no more distraction. No justification that holds. Only clarity remains. And most of the time, it doesn't come with panic. It comes quietly. Almost calmly. As if the person is finally seeing something that was always there, but chose not to look at. I'm not saying this as a warning, or as someone who has answers. Still see this happening. In different stories. Different people. But always with the same structure. And maybe what affects me the most is that this doesn't feel rare. It feels common. Quietly common. And that's exactly why I almost know. One notices while there's still time. Because it doesn't feel wrong. It doesn't feel urgent. It doesn't feel like something that needs to be interrupted. But in the end, that's exactly what shows up. Not what people failed to achieve. Not what went obviously wrong. But what was never truly lived with presence. And that doesn't make noise when it begins. But it does when it's finally seen.